What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. As most of you know, and like most of you, I'm somebody who has a couple books going all at the same time. Obviously, I've got Les Mis, and I've also got another book that I'm reading, a physical book, starting the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, and loving it so far. And then for all the work that I've got to do by hand out in the yard or around the house, I'm listening to the series Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. It was one of my parents' favorites, and I finally got around to listening to it. And it really made me think. If you've never heard of it, the gist of it is this lady goes back in time from, her life in 1940 something to Scotland in the 1740s. And it made me think a lot. I'm somebody who comes from a strong science fiction background. I love science fiction. And she's back in time, and I'm thinking about all the time travel books I've read. And I thought, how would I convince people in some ancient past that I was from the future if I had actually gone back in time? Could I convince them that I was from the future, or would they just think I was insane or possessed or any of the other things that happens to people you sometimes read about in time travel books? I think, I'm not a mechanical engineer, so I think that would be very handy. But I think I could convince people that either I'm from the future, or maybe I'm not, but I'm just a brilliant person because I'd invent, the internal combustion engine. I'm not, like I said, an engineer, but I basically know how that works, right? Get coals on fire, heat water, steam turn turbine turn gears. Boom, that's an engine. I feel like I could do pretty well. We could make one of those back in the day. And if that didn't convince people I was from the future, maybe they'd think I was a genius. Also, depending on what era it is, a lot of my favorite books have never been written. So I could just write them and pass them off on my own and, have that going. I mean, not that I'm a writer by any means, but I could take the stories of Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Ender's Game and put those out in the world, and people would, it would blow their minds. They'd love it. Anyways, let me know in the comments on the show or in an email what you would do if you were stuck in the past. Do you think you could survive? Do you think you could do it? What era would you want to go back to, etc.? Now, speaking of eras of the past, let's go to early 1800s France and Les Miserables. Chapter 11, The Honesty of Javert. On a morning when Monsieur Madeleine was busy in his office, disposing of urgent business in case he should find it necessary to go to Montfermeil, he was informed that Inspector Javert wished to speak to him. The name affected him disagreeably. Since their encounter in the police post, he had not seen Javert, who had been more careful than ever to avoid him. "Show him in," he said, and Javert entered. Monsieur Madeleine stayed seated at his desk, pen in hand, intent on the report he was reading of certain minor infringements of the law. He received Javert with deliberate coldness, being unable to forget Fantine. Javert respectfully saluted the mayor's back, while the latter, without looking up, continued to make notes in the margin of the document in front of him. The inspector advanced a few steps into the room, and then waited in silence. An observer with some knowledge of Javert's character, one who had studied that barbarian in the service of civilization, that bizarre composite of Roman and Spartan, monk and army corporal, that spy incapable of falsehood, that Simon pure watchdog, a physiognomist aware of his long-standing secret aversion for Madeleine and of the recent clash between them, would have been bound to ask, as he now looked at him, what has happened? To anyone familiar with that upright, honorable, inflexible, and ruthless conscience, it would have been apparent that Javert had passed through a serious personal crisis. There could be nothing in his soul that was not depicted on his countenance. Like all men of violence, he was subject to abrupt changes of mood. Never had his demeanor been more strange or mystifying. He had bowed to Monsieur Madeleine on entering with an expression in which there was no rancor, anger, or defiance, and then, halting a few paces from his chair, he He had stood rigidly upright in what was almost a parade ground attitude, with the naive, chilly uncouthness of a man who has never been gentle, but always patient. Without speaking or moving, in true humility and silent resignation, calm, serious, with his hat in his hand and his eyes downcast, his posture midway between that of a soldier in the presence of his officer and a guilty person confronting his judge, he stood, waiting until the mayor should see fit to notice him. All trace of the feelings and recollections one might have expected to see had vanished from that simple, rock-like countenance, except for its look of somber melancholy. His whole being expressed subjection and doggedness, a sort of gallantry and defeat. At length, the mayor put down his pen and half-turned towards him. "Well, Javert, what is it?" Javert paused for a moment as though to collect his thoughts. Then he said in a sad and solemn voice that was not without ingenuousness, "Monsieur le Maire, a serious breach of discipline has been committed." "What breach?" "An inferior member of the public service has shown the utmost disrespect for a magistrate. I have come, as in duty bound, to inform you of the fact." "Who is the offender?" asked Madeleine. "Myself," said Javert. "You?" "Yes." "And who is this magistrate who has been disrespectfully treated?" "You are, Monsieur le Maire." Monsieur Madeleine started up in his chair. Javert proceeded inexorably, with eyes still lowered. "I have come, Monsieur le Maire, to ask you to recommend to the authorities that I should be dismissed." The astonished Madeleine opened his mouth to speak, but Javert cut him short. "You may say that I can resign, but that would not be enough. To resign is an honorable proceeding. I have committed an offense, and I must be punished for it. I must be dismissed." After a brief pause, he added, "Monsieur le Maire, you treated me unjustly not long ago. This time, you must deal with me justly." "But what in the world are you talking about?" cried Madeleine. "In what way have you treated me with disrespect? What offense have you committed against me? What harm have you done me? You say you want to be relieved." "Dismissed," said Javert. "Very well, dismissed. I don't understand why." "I will explain, Monsieur le Maire." Javert heaved a deep sigh and said in the same dispassionate, disconsolate voice, "I was so furious after our dispute 6 weeks ago over that woman that I denounced you." "You denounced me?" "To the prefecture of police in Paris." Monsieur Madeleine, who was not much more given to laughter than Javert himself, now laughed heartily. As a mayor who had encroached on the function of the police? As an ex-convict. Madeleine's expression abruptly changed. Javert, who was still staring at the floor, continued. "That is what I believed. I had had the idea for a long time. A certain facial resemblance, the inquiries you caused to be made in Faverolles, the great physical strength you displayed in the Fauchelevent episode, your skill as a marksman, and your slight limp, all trifles. Nevertheless, I suspected you of being a man named Jean Valjean." "What name did you say?" "Jean Valjean. He was a convict I saw 20 years ago when I was a prison warder at Toulon. It seems that after being released, this Valjean committed a robbery at the house of a bishop, and then robbed a small boy on the public highway. Efforts were made to rearrest him, but he managed to get away, and there has been no trace of him for 8 years. Well, I believed... Anyway, that is what I did. In my resentment, I denounced you to the Paris prefecture." Monsieur Madeleine had returned to the documents on his desk. He asked in an entirely casual voice, "And what did they say?" "They said I was mad." "And?" "And they were right." "I'm glad you realize it." "They must be right, since the real Jean Valjean has been found." The sheet of paper fell from Madeleine's hand. He looked hard at Javert and murmured expressionlessly, "Indeed." "The facts are these," said Javert. "There was a man named Champmathieu living near the village of Ailly-la-Haute-Cloche. He was more or less destitute, one of those poor wretches of whom one wonders how they contrive to stay alive. Last autumn, he was arrested for stealing cider apples. The evidence was clear enough. He had climbed a wall, broken branches off trees. He was even caught with some of the apples on him. So he was taken into custody. Up to that point, it was no great matter, not much more than a case of petty larceny. But then, things took an unexpected turn. The local lockup was in bad repair, and so Champmathieu was transferred to the departmental prison at Arras. One of the prisoners at Arras was an old lag called Brevet, who had been made a trustee for good conduct. The moment he set eyes on Champmathieu, he exclaimed, "I know this man. He's an ex-convict. We were in prison together in Toulon more than 20 years ago. His name's Jean Valjean." Champmathieu, of course, denied it, saying he had never heard of Jean Valjean, but the matter had to be followed up. It was established that 30 years before, Champmathieu had been a tree pruner in various parts of the country, but particularly in Faverolles. There was a very long interval, but the trail was picked up again in Auvergne, and then in Paris, where he claims to have been a wheelwright and to have had a daughter who became a washerwoman, none of which is proved. Finally, he turned up in these parts. Well now, what was Jean Valjean before he went to prison for theft? He was a tree pruner. And where? In Faverolles. But that's not all. Valjean's baptismal name was Jean, and his mother's maiden name was Mathieu. It would be quite natural for him, when he came out of prison, to try to conceal his identity by adopting his mother's name and calling himself Jean Mathieu. He was in Auvergne, where the local accent turns Jean into Chan Mathieu, and from that it is a very short step to Champmathieu. I'm sure you follow me, Monsieur le Maire. Further inquiries were made in Faverolles, but no trace could be discovered of Jean Valjean's family. Nothing unusual in that. Families of that class quite commonly vanish from sight. When they aren't mud, they're dust. And after 30 years, there was no one in the place who remembered Jean Valjean. So then they tried Toulon, and here they found 2 other convicts who had known him. They were men serving life sentences, named Cochepaille and Chenildieu. They were brought to Arras, and at once confirmed Brevet's statement that the so-called Champmathieu was Jean Valjean. Same age, 54, same build, same general appearance, in a word, the same man. The confrontation took place almost on the day when I posted my letter of denunciation to Paris. They wrote back saying that I was out of my wits, and that Jean Valjean was in custody in Arras. I need not tell you the shock this gave me. I obtained permission to go to Arras to see this Champmathieu for myself. And, said Madeleine. Truth is truth, Monsieur le Maire, said Javert with the same somber, implacable expression. I am forced to admit that that man is Jean Valjean. I, too, recognized him. Madeleine asked in a very low voice, You're sure? Javert gave a dry laugh of reluctant but absolute certainty. Oh yes, I'm sure. He was silent for some moments, while mechanically he took a pinch of powdered wood from the blotting bowl on the desk. Indeed, now that I have seen the real Jean Valjean, I cannot imagine how I could have thought anything else. I must beg you to accept my most profound apologies, Monsieur le Maire. In addressing this humble request to the man who only a few weeks before had humiliated him in front of his own men, Javert, arrogant as he was, had assumed a simplicity and dignity of which he was quite unconscious. Madeleine's only reply was an abrupt question. And what does the man himself say? Well, you see, it's a bad business, Monsieur le Maire. If he's Valjean, he's broken parole. To climb a wall and steal apples can be a mere escapade if it's a boy, or a minor offense in a grown man, but in the case of a convict on parole, it's a crime. Breaking and entering and all the rest of it. Not just a case for the magistrates, but for trial at the assize. And the penalty is not just a few days in jail, but life imprisonment. And then there's the matter of the boy he robbed, the chimney sweep, if, as I hope, he can be found. In fact, Valjean's in a hopeless position, or would be, if it were anyone but Jean Valjean. But he's a cunning fellow, and there's another thing that makes me sure this is he. Where another man would be screaming the place down, ranting and raving and swearing that he had never heard of Valjean, this one behaves as though he simply didn't understand. My name's Champmathieu, and that's all I have to say. A kind of mulish stupidity, which is more effective. Oh, he's clever all right, but it won't work. The evidence is overwhelming. 4 people who recognize him. He's to be tried at Arras Assize, and I have been subpoenaed as a witness." Monsieur Madeleine had returned to the papers on his desk and was again poring over them and making notes with the air of a man with many things on his mind. He looked up at the inspector. "Thank you, Javert. The details do not greatly interest me, and in any case we have business to attend to. I want you to go at once to the woman Bussipede, who keeps an herb stall on the corner of the Rue Saint-Sauve, and tell her that she must lodge a complaint against Pierre Chesnelong, the carrier, who nearly ran her over and her daughter down. He's a reckless driver, and it's time he was taught a lesson. Then there's Monsieur Charcelli in the Rue Montre de Champigny, who complains that in heavy rain the water overflows out of his neighbor's gutter and floods his cellar. And there are reports of the contravention of police regulations in the Rue Guibourg, at the house of the widow Doris, and at the house of Madame Renée Labosse in the Rue de Giraud Blanc. They want looking into. But I'm giving you a lot to do. You say you have to go to Arras? I take it that will not be for a week or so." "Sooner than that, Monsieur le Maire. The case comes up tomorrow. I am catching the coach tonight." Monsieur Madeleine started slightly. How long will that take?" "Certainly not more than a day. Sentence will be passed tomorrow evening at the latest, but I don't intend to wait for it, since there's no doubt what it will be. I shall leave directly I've given my evidence." "Good," said Madeleine. He made a gesture of dismissal, but Javert did not move. "Forgive me, Monsieur le Maire. I have to remind you of something." "Of what?" "That I must be dismissed from the service." Monsieur Madeleine rose to his feet. "Javert, you are an honorable man, and I respect you highly. You are exaggerating your offense, which, in any case, is a matter that only concerns myself. You deserve to go up in the world, Javert, not down. I want you to stay in your present post." Javert confronted the mayor with a clear-eyed gaze in which there was the glint of a narrow conscience as rigid as it was upright. He said quietly, "Monsieur le Maire, I cannot agree to that." "I repeat," said Madeleine, "this is a matter that only affects me." But pursuing his own line of thought, Javert continued, "As to exaggerating, I have exaggerated nothing. This is how I see it. That I should have suspected you unjustly is not in itself important. It is our business to be suspicious, although we should be wary of suspecting our superiors. But you are a man of repute, a mayor, and a magistrate, and, in a fit of anger and a spirit of revenge, I denounced you, without evidence, as an ex-convict. That is very serious. I offended against authority in your person, and I am myself a representative of authority. If one of my subordinates had done this, I should have said that he was unworthy to be a member of the service and have seen to it that he was dismissed. Let me add one thing, Monsieur le Maire. I have often been harsh in my life. I have treated others harshly, and it was right that I should do so. But if I were not now equally harsh with myself, all my past acts would be unjustified. Am I to spare myself more than I spare others? To be the scourge of others and not of myself? It would be abominable, and the people who talk about that swine Javert would be right. I do not wish for your indulgence, Monsieur le Maire. I have been exasperated enough by your indulgence for others. I want none of it for myself. To me, the kind of indulgence which consists in supporting a woman of the town against a respectable citizen, or a police officer against a mayor, or in any form the lower against the higher, this is false indulgence which undermines society. God knows it's easy to be kind. The hard thing is to be just. If you had turned out to be what I suspected, Monsieur le Maire, I should have shown you no kindness. I must treat myself as I would treat any other man. I have often thought, when I was showing no mercy to evildoers, well, if ever you slip up, you know what to expect. And now I have slipped. I have committed an offense, and there it is. It is right that I should be dismissed and broken. I still have my hands. I can work in the fields. It is no great matter. I must be made an example of, Monsieur le Maire, for the good of the service. I request that Inspector Javert be dismissed." All this was said in a tone of high-flown humility and desperate conviction that endowed the strangely honest man with a bizarre greatness. "Well," said Monsieur Madeleine, "we shall have to see," and he held out his hand. Javert started back, saying harshly, "That is out of the question. A magistrate does not shake hands with an informer." He repeated the words under his breath. An informer. When I abused my powers as a police officer, I became nothing else. Bowing low, he turned and made for the door, but here he paused and said, still with his eyes lowered, "I shall continue to perform my duties, Monsieur le Maire, until I have been replaced." He went out, and Monsieur Madeleine stood thoughtfully listening to the firm, decided steps as they died away down the corridor. Book 7. The Champmathieu Affair. Chapter 1. Sister Simplice. Not all the events which follow became known in Montreuil-sur-Mer, but the scanty report of them which reached the town created so great a stir that we are bound to describe them in detail. The reader will find among them 2 or 3 improbable circumstances which we record in the interest of truth. During the afternoon following his interview with Javert, Monsieur Madeleine paid his customary visit to Fantine. Before doing so, he asked to see Sister Simplice, one of the 2 nursing sisters of the Order of St. Lazarus, who did the duty in his infirmary, the other being Sister Perpetua. Sister Perpetua was a plain countrywoman who had entered the service of God as she might have entered any other service, becoming a nun as she might become a cook. Such people are by no means rare, and the religious orders make no bones about accepting this raw material which can be readily shaped into a Capuchin or an Ursuline. Their function is to do the rough work. The transition from farm worker to Carmelite is an easy one, calling for no great effort. Village and cloister share a common ground of ignorance which puts the countryman on a level with the monk. A few added folds turn the peasant smock into a cassock. Sister Perpetua, who came from Marines near Pontoise, was a sturdy, patois-speaking, psalm-singing, grumbling servant of the church who sugared the tisane according to her opinion of the sufferer, rebuked the sick, scolded the dying, almost flinging God in their faces, castigating their death throes with angry, florid, honest, and forthright prayers. To compare Sister Simplice and her wax-like pallor with Sister Perpetua was like comparing a taper with a church candle. Vincent de Paul has beautifully depicted the Sister of Mercy in words that express both her freedom and her servitude. Their only convent is the sick room, their only cell a hired lodging, their chapel the parish church, their cloister the streets of the town or the hospital ward, their discipline obedience, their shelter the fear of God, and their veil modesty. This ideal was in Sister Simplice a living reality. No one knew her age. She had never been young, and it seemed that she would never grow old. She was a calm and austere person, we can hardly say woman, companionable but remote, who had never told a lie. She was so gentle as to seem fragile, but possessed a steely strength. She laid charmed fingers, slender and chaste, on the sufferer, and there was, as it were, a silence in her speech. She never spoke an unnecessary word, and the sound of her voice would have graced a confessional or delighted a drawing-room. Her delicacy had adapted itself to the rough serge gown she wore, which served her as a constant reminder of heaven. We must stress one particular. The fact that she never lied, had never spoken, for any reason or without reason, a word that was not strictly true, was the distinctive characteristic of Sister Simplice, the keynote of her virtue. Her unshakable truthfulness had made her almost celebrated in the community, and Abbé Sicard refers to it in a letter to the deaf-mute Massieu. However honest and incorruptible the rest of us may be, our candor is always flawed by, here and there, some small, innocent falsehood. But it was not so with her. Can there be such a thing as a white lie, a little lie? The lie is the absolute of evil. There can be no small lie. Who lies, lies wholly. The lie is the devil's own face. Satan has 2 names. He is Satan, and he is untruth. That is what Sister Simplice believed, the belief she practiced, and it was the source of the purity which shone from her, even from her lips and eyes. Her smile was pure, and her gaze was pure. There was no cobweb or any grain of dust on the unsullied mirror of that conscience. Upon entering the Order of St. Vincent de Paul, she had chosen the name Simplice in memory of the saint who had let her breasts be torn off, rather than say she had been born at Segesta when her birthplace was Syracuse, a lie which would have saved her. Sister Simplice, when she entered the order, had two weaknesses which she gradually corrected. She liked sweets, and she enjoyed getting letters. Her only reading was a book of Latin prayers in large print. She did not understand Latin, but she understood the book. She had conceived an affection for Fantine, no doubt perceiving the virtue latent within her, and had taken her almost wholly in her own charge. Monsieur Madeleine took Sister Simplice aside and recommended Fantine to her care in a tone so earnest that later she was to remember it. Then he went in to see Fantine. Fantine awaited his daily visits as we await warmth and happiness. She said to the sisters, "I'm only alive when the mayor is here." On this day, she had a high fever. Directly she saw him, she asked, "Cosette?" He answered, smiling, "Very soon." His manner towards her was normal, except that he stayed an hour instead of his usual half-hour, much to her delight. He stressed to everyone concerned that she must go short of nothing, and at one moment his face was seen to grow very somber. But this was explained when it became known that the doctor had murmured to him that she was sinking fast. Then he returned to the mairie, where his clerk saw him carefully studying a road map of France that hung in his office. He penciled some figures on a sheet of paper. Chapter 2. The Perspicacity of Master Scaufflaire. From the mairie, Madeleine crossed the town to call upon a Fleming named Scaufflaire, who hired out horses and carriages if required. The shortest way to his establishment was along a little frequented street in which was the presbytery of Madeleine's own parish. The curé was said to be a worthy man and a wise counselor. There was only one person in the street when Madeleine passed the presbytery, and this person happened to notice that after doing so he stopped, stood for a moment motionless, and then, turning back, made for the presbytery door, which had an iron knocker. He quickly seized hold of the knocker and raised it, but again he paused as though in thought, and, after a few moments, instead of knocking, gently released it and continued on his way rather more rapidly than before. He found Scaufflaire mending a piece of harness. "Master Scaufflaire," he asked, "have you a good horse?" "Oh, my horses are good, Monsieur le Maire," answered the Fleming. "What exactly do you mean?" "I want a horse that can do 20 leagues in a day." 20 leagues? Harnessed to a chaise?" "Yes." "And how much rest will it get at the end of it?" "It will have to come back the next day." "The same distance?" "Yes." "Love us and save us. A whole 20 leagues?" Madeleine produced the scrap of paper on which he had jotted down the figures 5, 6, and 8.5. 19.5 to be exact. Call it 20. "Well, Monsieur le Maire," said the Fleming, "I've got what you want, a small white horse from the Bas Boulonnais, a wonderful animal. They tried to make him into a saddle horse, but he threw all his riders, and no one could manage him. But I bought him and put him between shafts, and it turned out that that was what he wanted. Gentle as a girl and goes like the wind, provided you don't try to get on his back. He'll pull, but he won't carry. Everyone has their own ideas, and he seems to have got that one firmly in his head." "And he'll last the course?" 40 miles? He'll do it at a steady trot in under 8 hours, provided... "Provided what?" "Well, in the first place, he must have an hour's breather halfway, and you must keep an eye on him while he's eating to make sure the stable boy doesn't steal the oats. The thing I've found, stopping at inns, is that more oats get drunk by the stable boys than eaten by the horses." "I'll see to it." "Secondly, I take it the chaise is for yourself, Monsieur le Maire, and that you know how to drive?" "Yes." "You must travel alone and without baggage to keep down the weight." Certainly. The charge will be 30 francs a day, including rest days. I won't take a penny less, and you will pay for the animal's feed. Monsieur Madeleine got 3 Napoleon out of his purse and laid them on the table. There's 2 days in advance. One last thing, said Master Scaufflaire. A chaise would be too heavy for this trip. I must ask Monsieur le Maire to use my tilbury. Very well. Mark you, it's entirely open. That doesn't matter. Have you considered, Monsieur le Maire, that this is winter and that the weather's extremely cold? Madeleine made no reply to this, and the Fleming added, Or that it may rain? Monsieur Madeleine merely said, I want the horse and tilbury to be outside my door at 4:30 tomorrow morning. Very well, said Scaufflaire. He scratched with a fingernail at a small stain on the surface of the table, and said in the offhand manner with which the Flemish disguised their perspicacity, It occurs to me, Monsieur le Maire, that I still don't know exactly where you're going. He had been thinking of nothing else since the beginning of the interview, but for some reason had not ventured to put the question directly. Is this horse strong in the forelegs? Asked Madeleine. Yes, although you'll need to hold him up a little on the downslopes. Will there be many downslopes on this journey, Monsieur le Maire? Please be sure to have it round at my house punctually at 4:30, said Madeleine, and went out, leaving the Fleming flabbergasted, as he later said. But a few minutes later, the mayor returned, still with the same impenetrable, preoccupied manner. Monsieur Scaufflaire, what value do you put on your horse and tilbury, taking the two together? Or rather, one in front of the other, said the Fleming, attempting a joke. Well? Do I understand that Monsieur le Maire is proposing to buy them? No, but I wish to insure you against possible loss or injury. You will repay the money when I bring them back. How much? 500 francs, Monsieur le Maire. Here you are. Monsieur Madeleine laid a banknote on the table and again departed, this time not to return. Master Scaufflaire now bitterly regretted not having said 1,000. In fact, the horse and tilbury were worth about 100 francs. Scaufflaire called his wife and told her the story. Where the devil was the mayor going? They talked it over. He must be going to Paris, the lady said. I don't think so, said her husband. Madeleine had left behind the paper on which he had scribbled his figures. Scaufflaire studied it carefully. 5, 6, 8.5. They must be post stages. He looked at his wife. I've got it. Where? It's 5 leagues from here to Heston, 6 from Heston to St. Pol, and 8.5 from St. Pol to Arras. He's going to Arras. Monsieur Madeleine, meanwhile, was on his way home. This time he went a longer way round, as though deliberately avoiding the presbytery. He went up to his bedroom and shut himself in, which in itself was not unusual, for he often went to bed early. But the factory janitress, who was also his only servant, happening to notice that his light went out at 8:30, remarked to the cashier when he came in, Is the mayor not well? I thought he looked a little queer. The cashier occupied a room immediately below that of Monsieur Madeleine. Without paying much attention to what the janitress had said, he went to bed and to sleep. But towards midnight he was awakened by the sound of feet pacing up and down overhead, and he recognized the footsteps as those of Monsieur Madeleine. This was strange, for, as a rule, no sound came from Monsieur Madeleine's room until he rose in the morning. Then the cashier heard what sounded like the opening and shutting of a wardrobe, followed by the shifting of a piece of furniture. After this, the footsteps started again. The cashier, now wide awake, sat up in bed and saw through his window a red glow from a lit window reflected on the wall opposite. From its direction, the light could only be coming from Monsieur Madeleine's room, and its constant flickering suggested that it was the light of a fire rather than of a lamp. There was no shadow cast by window bars, which indicated that the window was wide open, and this, considering the coldness of the weather, was surprising. The cashier went back to sleep, but an hour or two later he woke again. The slow, steady footsteps were still pacing up and down above him. The light was still reflected on the wall, but now it was pale and steady, like that of a lamp or candle. The window was still open. We have now to relate what was happening in Monsieur Madeleine's room. Chapter 3. A Tempest in a Human Skull. The reader will have realized that Monsieur Madeleine was indeed Jean Valjean. We have already peered into the depths of that conscience, and must now do so again, although we cannot do so without trembling. Nothing is more terrifying than contemplation of this kind. Nothing discernible to the eye of the spirit is more brilliant or obscure than man. Nothing is more formidable, complex, mysterious, and infinite. There is a prospect greater than the sea, and it is the sky. There is a prospect greater than the sky, and it is the human soul. To make a poem of the human conscience, even in terms of a single man and the least of men, would be to merge all epics in a single epic transcending all. Conscience is the labyrinth of illusion, desire, and pursuit, the furnace of dreams, the repository of thoughts of which we are ashamed. It is the pandemonium of sophistry, the battlefield of passions. To peer at certain moments into the withdrawn face of a human being in the act of reflection, to see something of what lies beyond their outward silence, is to discern struggle on a Homeric scale, conflicts of dragons and hydras, aerial hosts as in Milton, towering vistas as in Dante. The infinite space that each man carries within himself, wherein despairingly he contrasts the movements of his spirit with the acts of his life, is an overpowering thing. Dante Alighieri found himself one day at a fateful doorway which he hesitated to enter. We too are confronted by such a doorway, and we too must hesitate, but enter nonetheless. There is little to be added to what the reader already knows about Jean Valjean following his encounter with the boy Petit Gervais. Thereafter, as we have seen, he was a changed man, enacting in his life what the bishop had sought to make of him. It was more than a transformation, it was a transfiguration. He contrived to vanish, sold the bishop's silver, keeping only the candlesticks as a reminder, and worked his way from town to town across France until eventually he came to Montreuil-sur-Mer. Here he established himself in the manner we have described, rendering himself both unassailable and inaccessible, and, with a conscience darkened by his past, but in the knowledge that the second half of his life was a repudiation of the first, settled down to live peaceably and hopefully with only two objects in mind: to conceal his true identity and sanctify his life, and to escape from men and find his way back to God. The two considerations were so closely linked as to be inseparable in his mind, both so absorbing and overriding as to govern his every act. As a rule, they worked harmoniously in his daily conduct, inclining him towards aloofness, making him benevolent and simple, both guiding him along the same path. But it happened occasionally that there was a clash between them, and on these occasions, as we have seen, the man known to Montreuil-sur-Mer as Monsieur Madeleine did not hesitate to sacrifice the first consideration to the second, his personal security to his moral principles. Against all prudence, he had kept the bishop's candlesticks and worn mourning for him. He sought out and questioned every vagabond boy who passed through the town. He had had inquiries made among the families in Faverolles, and he had saved the life of old Fauchelevent, regardless of Javert's penetrating eye. He had, it seems, concluded, after the manner of saints and sages, that his first duty was not to himself. But no situation like the present had ever before arisen. Never had the two principles governing the life of this unfortunate man been brought so sharply into conflict. He had been made to realize this, still confusedly but profoundly, by the first words spoken by Javert when he entered his room. When the name he had sought to bury under so many layers of concealment was so unexpectedly uttered, he had been completely stunned, dazed by the sinister quixotry of his destiny, and in his bewilderment he had known the tremor that precedes any great shock. He had bowed like an oak tree at the approach of a tempest, or a soldier at the approach of an attack. He had felt the thunderclouds massing above his head, and his first thought, as he listened to Javert, was to throw in his hand, to give himself up, get the man Champmathieu out of prison, and take his place. It was a thought as piercing and agonizing as a knife thrust in living flesh. But then it passed, and he said to himself, "Steady, steady." Repressing that first generous impulse, he recoiled from the heroic act. Certainly, it would have been a great thing if, following the bishop's solemn admonition, after the years of repentance and self-denial, and in the full flood of rehabilitation so well begun, he had not faltered even in the face of this fearful dilemma, but had steadily pursued his course towards the abyss in the heart of which lay spiritual salvation. It would have been a great thing, but it did not happen. We must give a true account of what took place in his soul and of nothing else. The first victor was the instinct of self-preservation. He hastily reordered his thoughts, controlled his emotions, took due note of the perilous proximity of Javert, postponed any final decision with a firmness inspired by terror, concentrated upon what has to be done, and recovered his calm like a warrior retrieving his shield. During the rest of the day, he remained in that state of inward turmoil and outward serenity, taking only what may be termed safety precautions. Everything was confusion in his mind, to the extent that he could see nothing clearly and could only have accounted for himself by saying that he had been dealt a stunning blow. He paid his customary visit to Fantine and prolonged it from kindness, and with a feeling that he must lay particular injunctions on the sister in case he should be obliged to be absent. He had a vague notion that he should go to Arras without being at all decided about it, telling himself that since he was exempt from all suspicion, it could do no harm for him to go and see what happened, and so he hired the tilbury, in case he should need it. He dined with a good appetite, but back in his bedroom, he began to think. He reviewed his situation and found it unbelievable, so much so that at one moment, prompted by an almost reasonless impulse, he got up from his chair and bolted the door. He was afraid of what might enter, barricading himself against the impossible. The lamp worried him, and he blew it out, afraid lest someone should see him. Who? Alas, what he sought to exclude and to stifle was already present in the room. It was his own conscience. His conscience, that is to say, God. But for a time, he was able to lull himself into a sense of security. With the door bolted, no one could lay hands on him, and with the light extinguished, he was invisible. Seated in darkness with his elbows on the table and his head resting on his hands, he reflected. Where am I? Is this a dream? Did I really see Javert, and did he really say those things? This man Champmathieu, does he really look so like me? Is it conceivable? When I think how untroubled I was yesterday morning, how far from suspecting anything, what was I doing at that time? What does this whole business mean? What am I to do now? Such was his state of torment. His brain had lost the power to grasp the thoughts that sped like waves through it while he clutched his forehead in an effort to control them. It was a turmoil swamping his willpower and reason, from which nothing emerged except the sense of his own anguish as he sought in vain for clarity and resolve. His head was burning. He got up and flung open the window. There were no stars in the sky. He came back and sat down again at the table. The first hour passed in this fashion. By degrees, the thoughts began to crystallize in his mind, and he was able to take a clearer view of his situation, not as a whole, but in certain of its details. He perceived that, extraordinary and critical though it was, he was nevertheless entirely master to it. This merely deepened his perplexity. Apart from their strict underlying religious intention, his every act until that day had been for the purpose of digging a hole in which his real name might be buried. What he had most feared, in his moments of recollection and his wakeful nights, was to hear that name spoken. He had said to himself that the rebirth of that name would for him mean the end of everything, the destruction of the new life he had built, even, who could tell, of the new soul he had fashioned. The thought alone, the very possibility, made him shudder. Had anyone told him that a day would come when the name, the hideous words Jean Valjean, would suddenly resound in his ears like a thunderclap, coming like a blaze of light out of darkness to tear aside the mystery in which he had disguised himself. And had they gone on to tell him that this would be no threat unless he chose to make it so, that the light would serve merely to deepen his disguise, and that the worthy Monsieur Madeleine, being confronted with the ghost of Jean Valjean, might emerge from the encounter even more honored and secure than before. Had anyone said this to him, he would have stared in amazement, thinking the words insane. Yet this was precisely what had happened. This heaping up of impossibilities was a fact. God had allowed the fantasy to become reality. As his mind cleared, he became more precisely aware of his position. It was as though he had awakened out of sleep to find himself sliding down a slope in darkness, upright and shivering, struggling in vain to check his descent on the edge of a precipice. He saw clearly the figure of another man, a stranger, whom destiny had mistaken for himself and was thrusting into that chasm. Someone had to go into the chasm, he or another, if it was to be sealed up. He had only to let things take their course.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout-out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.